The cold winter morning of January 2024 felt like tiny needles on James Wilson's face. At 45 years old, he never thought he would end up standing outside a fancy apartment building on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, asking strangers for money. His cardboard sign, now worn from the winter snow and rain, simply read, "Lost everything. Need help. God bless." James pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. The jacket, given to him by a church shelter 3 months ago, wasn't enough for New York's harsh winter. His fingers, red and stiff from the cold, gripped the sign as businessmen and women hurried past him, most of them looking down at their phones or pretending he didn't exist. 8 months earlier, James had a different life. He lived in a small but comfortable apartment in Queens, worked as a construction site manager, and even had savings in the bank. But life had other plans. One evening, while crossing the street after work, a speeding car hit him. The driver ran away, leaving James with broken legs and a serious head injury. The hospital bills came like a flood. Even with his insurance, the costs were too high. Physical therapy, surgeries, and medications quickly ate through his savings. His construction company held his job for 3 months, but when he couldn't return to work, they had to let him go. Without a paycheck, he couldn't pay his rent. Soon, the eviction notice came. James remembered the day he had to leave his apartment. The landlord wasn't mean about it, but rules were rules. He packed what he could into 2 bags, gave his furniture to his neighbors, and walked out of the building he had called home for 7 years. His limp was still bad then, making each step painful. The first few nights, he slept on his friend Mike's couch. But Mike had a family of 4 in a small 2-bedroom apartment, and James knew he couldn't stay long. He tried other friends, but everyone had their own problems. The city shelters were often full, and some weren't safe. Soon, the streets became his home. James wasn't like some of the other homeless people he met. He stayed clean, didn't drink or use drugs, and always tried to be polite. Every morning, he would wash up in public bathrooms, keeping himself as presentable as possible. He went to the library daily, using their computers to look for jobs and send out resumes. But without a permanent address or phone number, most companies wouldn't even consider him. The hardest part wasn't the cold or hunger. It was the way people looked at him, or rather, how they didn't look at him at all. He had become invisible. People would walk around him like he was a lamppost or trash can. Some days, he wouldn't hear a single human voice speak to him. Today marked his 245th day on the streets. James kept count in a small notebook he carried. Writing down the days helped him feel like he hadn't completely lost control of his life. He had developed a routine: wake up early in the church doorway where he slept, clean up in the McDonald's bathroom, get free coffee from a kind shop owner named Mrs. Chen, and then stand outside different buildings, hoping to collect enough money for food. This particular morning, he chose the luxury apartment building because the doorman, Robert, was kind. Robert would sometimes sneak him a cup of hot chocolate when his supervisor wasn't looking. They never talked much, but that small act of kindness meant the world to James. As he stood there, watching the expensive cars drive by and well-dressed people hurry to their offices, James thought about his own father. A hard-working man who always said, "Life can change in a minute's stun. Always be kind, because you never know when you'll need kindness yourself." Those words rang truer now than ever before. The morning crowd was starting to thin out when James noticed more security guards than usual around the building entrance. Something was different today. Black SUVs were pulling up, and men in suits with earpieces were talking into their radios. James considered moving to a different spot, but something told him to stay. He didn't know it yet, but this ordinary winter morning was about to become the most extraordinary day of his life. As he adjusted his sign and stamped his feet to keep warm, the door of one of the black SUVs opened, and a tall young man stepped out. This moment would change everything, though James had no way of knowing that yet. The black SUV's arrival brought a different energy to the usually quiet street. Security personnel moved with practiced precision, forming a protective circle around the vehicle. James watched as the rear door opened smoothly, and a tall, well-dressed young man stepped out. At first glance, there was something familiar about him, but James couldn't quite place it. The young man was Barron, now 18 years old and already making his mark in the business world. His height was striking. He stood at least 6'7", and he wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit that made him look older than his years. His brown hair was neatly styled, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had grown up in the spotlight. The security team, led by a stern-faced man named Marcus, scanned the area continuously. They had gotten used to Barron's frequent visits to this building, where he was developing his first solo real estate project. Still, they remained alert, watching every movement on the street with trained eyes. James noticed how different this scene was from the usual morning crowd. The other pedestrians had stopped too, many pulling out their phones to take pictures. Some whispered and pointed, recognizing the former president's youngest son. But James, who had been cut off from news and media during his months on the streets, saw only another wealthy young man. Taking a deep breath and gathering his courage, James did something he hadn't done before. Instead of waiting for someone to approach him, he took a step forward. The security team immediately tensed, but James was focused on the young man. His voice, hoarse from the cold morning air, called out, "Excuse me, sir. Could you spare $1 for some coffee?" The reaction was immediate. Two security guards moved to intercept James, but something unexpected happened. Barron, who had been checking his phone, looked up. Unlike most people who pass by James every day, Barron actually looked at him, not through him or around him, but directly at him, making eye contact. "Stand down," Barron said to his security team, his voice carrying the kind of authority that seemed beyond his years. The guards hesitated but followed his order, stepping back slightly while remaining alert. The other people on the street had formed a small crowd now, phones recording the scene. They probably expected Barron to either ignore James or quickly hand him some money to avoid an awkward situation. That's what most people did when they did decide to give anything. But Barron did neither. Instead, he put his phone in his pocket and took a few steps closer to James. The morning sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk as these two men, one at the very top of society and one at the bottom, stood face to face. "Coffee, you said?" Barron asked, his voice carrying genuine interest rather than dismissal. He looked at James' worn clothes, taking in the details that told the story of months of hardship. James nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious under the young man's direct gaze and the stares of the gathering crowd. He hadn't expected this kind of attention. Usually, people either gave him money or ignored him, both interactions lasting only seconds. The security team shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't part of their usual routine. Marcus, the head of security, checked his watch pointedly. Barron had a meeting scheduled in 20 minutes with important investors for his new project. But Barron seemed unconcerned about his schedule. He studied James's face, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the dignity he maintained despite his circumstances. Something about this man was different from what Barron had expected. $1 for coffee seems like a small request," Barron said, reaching into his pocket. But instead of pulling out his wallet, he drew out his phone again. The crowd watched, phone still recording, as Barron did something unexpected. "Before we talk about coffee," he said, "I'd like to hear your story. Would you mind sharing it with me?" The morning traffic continued to flow behind them, horns honking in the distance, but on this small piece of sidewalk, time seemed to stand still. James looked at the young man in front of him, trying to understand what was happening. In all his months on the street, no one had ever asked to hear his story. What happened next would soon be shared thousands of times on social media, making headlines across the country and changing both men's lives forever. The crowd grew larger as James began to share his story with Barron. The security team had formed a wider circle around them, keeping curious onlookers at a respectful distance. The morning sun had risen higher now, making the frost on the ground sparkle like tiny diamonds. "I wasn't always like this," James began, his voice shaking slightly. He noticed that Barron was listening intently, something rare in his recent experiences. 8 months ago, I was a construction foreman, managing big projects across the city." Barron's eyes lit up with interest. "Construction. What kind of projects did you work on?" He gestured toward a nearby coffee cart, and one of his security team members quickly brought 2 cups of hot coffee. James wrapped his cold hands around the warm cup, grateful for both the drink and the chance to be heard. As they stood there, James pointed to various buildings in the skyline, describing projects he had helped build. His knowledge was evident as he talked about steel structures, foundation work, and city-building codes. Barron listened carefully, occasionally asking detailed questions that showed he understood the construction business. "The accident changed everything," James continued, his voice growing quieter. He described the hit and run, the months of surgery and rehabilitation, and the mounting medical bills that eventually took everything from him. As he spoke, Barron's expression changed from interest to genuine concern. The crowd around them had grown even larger, with people recording videos and taking pictures. Some were live streaming the conversation on their phones, but neither James nor Barron seemed to notice. They were absorbed in their conversation, two people connecting on a human level despite their vastly different circumstances. The hardest part, James said, taking a sip of his coffee, isn't being homeless. It's feeling invisible. People look right through you, like you don't exist anymore. His words made several onlookers lower their phones, suddenly conscious of their own behavior toward the homeless people they passed every day. Barron nodded thoughtfully, removing his expensive coat. Without hesitation, he placed it around James's shoulders. The security team exchanged glances, but remained silent. "You're not invisible, Mr. Wilson," Barron said firmly. "And you shouldn't be out here in this cold." The coat was warm and heavy, probably worth more than James used to make in a month. He tried to refuse it, but Barron insisted. "Keep it," he said. "But I want to do more than just give you a coat." Marcus, the head of security, stepped forward to remind Barron about his upcoming meeting. But Barron waved him off, pulling out his phone again. "Those investors can wait," he said. "This is more important." James watched as Barron scrolled through his contacts. "You said you were a construction foreman?" Barron asked, though he already knew the answer. "What if I told you I'm developing a new building just 3 blocks from here, and we're actually looking for experienced site supervisors?" The crowd had grown completely silent, watching the scene unfold. James stood straighter, years of professional instinct kicking in despite his current situation. "I know every regulation in the book," he said with quiet confidence. "I can run a site with 50 workers and keep everything on schedule." Barron smiled, already dialing a number on his phone. "That's exactly what I need to hear. But first," he turned to another security team member. "John, get Mr. Wilson's sizes. We're going to need proper work clothes." Then to Marcus, "Find a hotel nearby, a good one. Mr. Wilson needs a proper place to stay while we sort this out." James felt overwhelmed, tears forming in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he started, but Barron cut him off gently. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "This isn't charity, Mr. Wilson. If what you told me about your experience is true, I'm the one who's getting a good deal here. I need someone who knows what they're doing, and you need a chance to prove you still know how to do it. Deal?" He held out his hand, and James shook it firmly. The crowd around them burst into applause, but both men barely noticed. They were focused on the conversation that would change both their lives, though in very different ways. As Barron's team began making arrangements, neither man realized that this moment would soon become a viral sensation, inspiring millions and challenging perceptions about homelessness, compassion, and second chances. The next 15 minutes unfolded like a dream for James. He sat in a quiet corner of a nearby coffee shop with Barron, while security kept curious onlookers outside. The warm air inside felt strange after months of constant exposure to the cold, and the leather chair he sat in was softer than anything he'd touched in a long time. "Tell me more about your construction experience," Barron said, his laptop open on the table between them. A fresh cup of coffee and a sandwich sat in front of James, but he was too nervous to eat. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his worn notebook. "I started as a regular worker 20 years ago," James explained, his voice growing stronger as he talked about his life's work. "Worked my way up from carrying bricks to managing entire sites. My last project was a 40-story building in Brooklyn." He opened his notebook, showing Barron the detailed notes he kept of his past projects. Barron leaned forward, genuinely impressed by the precise drawings and calculations in James's notebook. "You kept all this with you, even on the streets?" he asked, carefully turning the pages filled with architectural sketches and construction notes. James nodded. "This notebook and my work boots, they're all I have left from my old life. Couldn't let them go. They remind me of who I really am." His voice cracked slightly at these words, and he quickly took a sip of coffee to hide his emotion. Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. News vans were starting to arrive, drawn by the viral social media posts about Barron Trump talking to a homeless man. But inside the coffee shop, the two men remained focused on their conversation. Barron made another call, this time putting it on speaker. Sarah, I found our new site supervisor for the Fifth Avenue project. His name is James Wilson, and he has 20 years of experience. He looked at James. Can you set up an interview with the construction team for this afternoon? The woman on the phone sounded surprised but professional. Of course, Mr. Trump. We'll need his resume and credentials. She paused, likely realizing the unusual situation. James will explain his circumstances in the interview, Barron said firmly. I want you to focus on his experience and knowledge. They'll be there at 2 p.m. He ended the call and turned back to James. Now, we have some work to do before that interview. Over the next hour, they created a new resume on Barron's laptop. James remembered every project, every certification, and every achievement from his career. As they worked, his confidence slowly returned. He even started eating the sandwich, realizing how hungry he was. Marcus, the head of security, approached their table. Mr. Trump, the hotel room is ready, and we've arranged for some clothes to be delivered there. He handed James a key card to the Plaza Hotel, making his eyes widen in disbelief. The Plaza? James whispered, holding the key card like it might disappear. That's too much. I can't. You can and you will, Barron interrupted. You need a proper address for employment paperwork, and you need to look and feel your best for this interview. Consider it an investment in my future construction supervisor. James looked down at his worn clothes, suddenly very aware of his appearance. Barron seemed to read his mind. John will take you to the hotel now. Get cleaned up, try on the new clothes, and rest for a bit. The interview isn't for 4 hours. As James stood to leave, Barron held out his hand. I believe in second chances, Mr. Wilson. But more than that, I believe in hiring the right person for the job. Don't let either of us down. James shook his hand firmly, standing straight despite his worn clothes. I won't, sir. I promise you that. As John led James out through the back door of the coffee shop, away from the growing media presence, Barron watched them go. He'd seen something in James that reminded him of lessons his father had taught him about recognizing real talent and the importance of giving people a chance to prove themselves. Marcus approached again. Sir, the investors are still waiting. Tell them we're rescheduling, Barron replied, still watching as James disappeared into the waiting car. Some investments are more important than others. He turned back to James's notebook, still open on the table, studying the detailed drawings of buildings reaching toward the sky, drawings that had kept one man's hope alive during the darkest months of his life. James stood in his Plaza Hotel bathroom, staring at his reflection in the giant mirror. The man looking back at him was both familiar and strange. After a hot shower, his first in months, and a professional haircut arranged by Barron's team, he barely recognized himself. The hotel room itself was bigger than his old apartment. Fresh clothes lay neatly on the king-size bed, a charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, blue tie, and shining black leather shoes. Each item fit perfectly, making him wonder how they had guessed his sizes so accurately. A soft knock at the door made him jump. It was John, the security team member assigned to help him. Mr. Wilson, are you ready to review some things before the interview? James opened the door, now dressed in his new suit. John nodded approvingly and entered with a leather portfolio. Mr. Trump asked me to go over the project details with you. He wants you fully prepared for the interview. For the next hour, they reviewed the plans for Barron's new building project. It was a 50-story mixed-use development, combining luxury apartments with office space and retail. As James studied the blueprints, his old expertise came flooding back. These support columns, he pointed out, they could be optimized for better cost efficiency without compromising structural integrity. He grabbed a notepad from the hotel desk and quickly sketched his idea. John took photos of James's drawings with his phone. Mr. Trump will want to see these, he said, impressed. You really do know your stuff. Meanwhile, across town, Barron was making more calls. He reached out to his contacts at the construction company, emphasizing James's experience but also being honest about his current situation. He's had bad luck, Barron explained to the company's CEO, but his knowledge is exactly what we need. Back at the hotel, James practiced interview questions with John. His hands shook less now, and his voice grew stronger as he discussed construction techniques and site management strategies. Years of experience flowed naturally into his answers. At 1:30 p.m., a sleek black car arrived to take James to the interview. As he rode through Manhattan's busy streets, he thought about how much had changed in just a few hours. That morning, he had been invisible on the streets. Now, he was heading to an interview for a position that could change his life. The construction company's office was in a modern glass building. In the elevator, James took deep breaths, remembering all the times he'd done this before, all the sites he'd managed successfully. He touched the notebook in his pocket, his constant companion from the streets, for luck. The interview room was filled with serious-looking executives. But as James began speaking about construction, answering their technical questions, and sharing his ideas for the new project, their expressions changed from skepticism to interest. "Your suggestion about the support columns is actually brilliant," said the head architect, looking at the drawings John had sent over. "It could save us millions without compromising safety." Halfway through the interview, Barron quietly entered the room. He stood at the back, watching as James confidently explained his approach to site management. The executives were now leaning forward, engaged in the discussion. Sarah, the HR director who had spoken to Barron earlier, looked impressed. "Mr. Wilson, despite your recent circumstances, your knowledge is exceptional. However, we need to discuss the gap in your employment history." Before James could respond, Barron stepped forward. "That gap shows something important," he said. "It shows a man who kept his skills sharp and his spirit unbroken despite incredible hardship. It shows someone who never gave up." The room fell silent. Barron continued, "I'm not just the developer on this project. I'm making a personal guarantee for Mr. Wilson. His expertise is exactly what we need." The CEO nodded slowly, looking at James with new respect. "Mr. Wilson, could you start tomorrow?" James sat straighter in his chair, feeling tears threatening to form in his eyes. "Yes, sir, I can start right now if you need me to." The executive smiled, and hands were extended for handshakes. As papers were being prepared and details discussed, Barron slipped out of the room, leaving James to his moment of triumph. Outside, the story of their morning encounter had already gone viral, but neither man was paying attention to that. They were both focused on what mattered, giving a skilled professional a chance to rebuild his life, one building at a time. The interview room emptied slowly as executives filed out, each stopping to shake James's hand. Once alone, the emotion he had been holding back finally broke free. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he sat in the leather chair, his hands covering his face. This was how Barron found him when he returned a few minutes later. Without saying a word, he pulled up a chair and sat next to James, letting him have this moment. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the carpeted floor. "I never stopped believing," James finally said, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief from his new suit pocket. "Even on the coldest nights, I kept telling myself that things would change. But this," he gestured at the employment contract in front of him, "this feels like a dream." The contract outlined his position as site supervisor, with a salary that was even higher than what he'd earned before. It included full medical benefits, the thing that had cost him everything in the first place, and a signing bonus that would help him get back on his feet. Outside the building, a crowd had gathered. News of the morning's events had spread rapidly across social media. Clips of their sidewalk conversation had gone viral, with millions of views already. But up in the quiet interview room, none of that mattered. "Mr. Trump," James started, but Barron interrupted him. "Please, call me Barron. We're going to be working together after all." James nodded, composing himself. "Barron, I don't know how to thank you, not just for the job, but for seeing me as a person this morning. For listening." Security Chief Marcus appeared at the door. "Sir, there's significant media presence outside. They're requesting statements." Barron shook his head. "No statements. This isn't about publicity." He turned to James. "Are you ready to see your new workplace?" They took the elevator to the construction site 3 blocks away. As they walked through the partially completed building, James' professional instincts took over. He noticed details, made mental notes, and started forming plans for improvements. "The crews need better organization here," he said, pointing to a cluttered area. "We can improve efficiency by at least 30% with proper material placement." His voice was strong now, confident. This was his element. The current workers watched curiously as James and Barron toured the site. Word had already spread about the new supervisor and how he had been hired. Some had seen the viral videos. They observed as James inspected ongoing work, noting his experienced eye and professional demeanor. When they reached the top floor, James walked to the edge, looking out over the city. Somewhere down there was the spot where he had slept last night, the cardboard sign he'd held that morning. It felt like a lifetime ago. Your first task, Barron said, joining him at the edge, is to review all current operations and suggest improvements. I want this to be the most efficient site in Manhattan. It will be, James promised, his voice firm. I won't let you down. As they descended in the construction elevator, Barron handed James a phone. You'll need this for work. Your hotel room is paid for 2 weeks, enough time to find an apartment. John will help you with that. The elevator reached the ground floor, and they could see the crowd of reporters through the site's security fence. James tensed, but Barron placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Remember, Barron said, you earned this position with your knowledge and experience. What happened this morning was just 2 people meeting at the right time. James nodded, straightening his tie. The tears were gone now, replaced by determination. He was James Wilson, construction site supervisor, once again. As they walked toward the waiting cars, reporters called out questions. But both men kept walking, focused on the work ahead. James thought about all the people still on the streets, still invisible to most passersby. He made a silent promise to himself that once he was back on his feet, he would find ways to help others like himself. The day was ending, but for James, it felt like a new beginning. Tomorrow, he would return not as a man asking for help, but as a professional ready to lead. His story was already inspiring thousands online, though he didn't know it yet. What he did know was that his hands would be busy again, his mind engaged with the work he loved, and his dignity restored, not through charity, but through an opportunity to prove his worth. James's first day as site supervisor began before sunrise. He arrived at the construction site at 6 a.m., wearing his new hard hat and work boots, ready to meet his crew. The morning air was crisp, but unlike yesterday, he wore proper warm clothing and carried a briefcase containing his old notebook and new project plans. The workers arrived in groups, eyeing their new supervisor with curiosity. Many had seen the viral videos of his encounter with Barron Trump, which had now reached over 10 million views across social media platforms. But what impressed them more was how James handled that first morning meeting. I know some of you have seen the videos. James addressed the assembled crew of 30 workers. Yes, I was homeless yesterday, but for 20 years before that, I ran sites like this one. Today, we start making this the best managed construction project in New York. He pulled out his notebook and began outlining changes. His knowledge was obvious as he pointed out inefficiencies in their current system. The workers listened intently as he explained new safety protocols and better ways to organize their workflow. By mid-morning, the site was transforming. Equipment that had been scattered was now properly placed for maximum efficiency. Safety barriers were reinforced, and work zones were clearly marked. The crew quickly realized that their new supervisor knew exactly what he was doing. See how the crane's positioning was slowing down material delivery? James explained to his team leaders during their first break. By adjusting its rotation path, we can cut delivery time in half. The other managers nodded, already seeing the improvement. Around noon, Barron visited the site for a progress inspection. He found James up on the 15th floor, checking steel beam installations. The change in James from yesterday was remarkable. He moved with authority, carried himself with confidence, and had already earned his crew's respect. How's it going? Barron asked, though the improved organization of the site answered his question. James smiled, pointing to his clipboard. We're already 20% more efficient than yesterday. By the end of the week, I can get that up to 40%. He showed Barron his detailed plans for restructuring work schedules and material handling. The crew's lunch break revealed another side of James's leadership. Instead of eating in the site office, he sat with his workers, listening to their concerns and suggestions. He remembered what it was like to be invisible and made sure every worker knew their voice mattered. My supervisor back in '95 taught me something important, he told a young worker who was struggling with a complex task. There's no such thing as unskilled labor, just different levels of expertise. You've got good instincts. Let me show you an easier way to do that. By the end of his first day, James had reorganized the entire site's workflow, implemented new safety measures, and learned every worker's name. The crew, initially skeptical of their formerly homeless supervisor, had become believers in his leadership. As the workers left for the day, one of the older crew members, Mike, approached James. "Boss, I've been doing this work for 30 years, he said. Never seen anyone turn a site around this fast. You really know your stuff." James thanked him, remembering his own early days in construction. As he packed up his things in the site office, he found a note from Barron. "Knew I made the right choice. Keep up the great work." That evening, instead of heading to a street corner or shelter, James returned to his hotel room. He sat at the desk, reviewing plans for tomorrow, making notes for improvements, and feeling truly alive again. His phone buzzed with messages from contractors and suppliers, already responding to his new directives. Before going to bed, he looked out his hotel window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, others were spending another night on the streets, just as he had done yesterday. He made a decision then to talk to Barron about starting a program to hire homeless individuals with useful skills and experience. The local news that evening ran a story about his first day, from homeless to hero. Construction supervisor proves second chances work. But James wasn't watching. He was too busy planning tomorrow's tasks, focused on proving that Barron's faith in him was well placed. As he finally lay down to sleep in a real bed, James thought about how much can change in just one day. Yesterday, he had asked for $1 for coffee. Today, he had supervised a multi-million-dollar construction project. Tomorrow, he would do it even better. 6 months after that life-changing morning, James Wilson stood at the window of his new office on the 30th floor of the completed Trump building. The view of Manhattan stretched before him, including the construction site he now managed with a crew of 50 workers. His office walls displayed his construction licenses and a framed news article about his journey from homeless to construction executive. The morning's management meeting had just ended, where James had presented his new initiative, the Second Chance Program. Barron Trump sat at the conference table, reviewing the proposal with genuine interest. "We've identified 15 homeless individuals with valuable trade skills," James explained, pointing to his presentation. "Former electricians, plumbers, carpenters, all of them lost everything due to medical bills or other circumstances beyond their control, just like I did." Barron nodded, remembering their first meeting. "How many can we hire immediately?" "All of them," James replied confidently. "I've already interviewed each person. They just need what I got. A chance to prove themselves." The program was approved that morning. By afternoon, James was making calls to shelters and outreach centers, setting up interviews and arranging for work clothes and temporary housing. His own experience made him the perfect person to lead this initiative. His personal life had also transformed. James now lived in a comfortable apartment in Queens, not far from his old neighborhood. Every morning, he stopped at Mrs. Chen's coffee shop, the same kind woman who used to give him free coffee when he was homeless. Now he bought coffee for anyone who couldn't afford it. The viral video of his encounter with Barron had sparked a national conversation about homelessness and second chances. James had been invited to speak at conferences and city council meetings, sharing his story and advocating for better health care coverage and housing assistance programs. "Your story changed how people think about homelessness," a reporter had told him during a recent interview. "It showed that anyone could end up on the streets, and that many homeless people have valuable skills to offer." James kept his old notebook in his desk drawer, a reminder of the days he spent on the streets. Sometimes, when facing a tough decision, he would open it and look at the careful drawings and notes he had made during those difficult months. They reminded him to stay humble and grateful. His relationship with Barron had evolved from benefactor and recipient to genuine friendship and mutual respect. They'd often discussed construction projects together, with James' practical experience complementing Barron's business vision. "Remember that morning when I asked you for $1? James said to Barron as they inspected their latest project. "I never did get that coffee." Barron laughed. "No, but you got something better. You got your life back. And we got one of the best construction supervisors in New York." The success of their first project had led to more opportunities. James now oversaw multiple construction sites across the city, each running with the same efficiency he had brought to his first site. His crews were known for their safety records and on-time completion rates. Through the Second Chance program, James had already helped 10 people rebuild their lives. Each success story reinforced his belief that many homeless people just needed an opportunity to show their worth. One of his favorite moments was hiring Mike, a former electrician he had known from his days on the street. Mike now supervised all electrical work on their projects, and his expertise had saved them thousands in installation costs. As the sun set over Manhattan, James prepared to leave his office. His desk held photos of his crews, including one of the original team from his first day as supervisor. Next to it sat a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Local construction executive builds hope for homeless workers." Before heading home, James took his usual walk through the current construction site. Workers called out greetings, some still amazed that their boss had once been homeless. But James made sure they knew that his past was not a weakness but a strength. It had taught him the value of every person's dignity and potential. As he drove home that evening, James passed the luxury apartment building where he had stood with his cardboard sign 6 months ago. The spot looked different now, or maybe he saw it differently. To him, it was no longer a place of despair, but a reminder that life could change in an instant, sometimes for the better. That night, as he had done every night since his life changed, James said a quiet thank you for his second chance and made plans for how he could help others get theirs.